Good morning, guys. Yeah. So from this week onwards, we are going to start talking about the interaction between the state and the people, and we are going to interrogate different thematic topics. We are going to start out with the sectarianism and identity politics today. So this is the structure of the lectures. We are going to start out with some definitions. What do we mean by ethnic identity? What constitutes ethnicity or ethnic identity? Is something unique about ethnicity, and how can we differentiate between sectarianism and ethnic politics? Like sectarian and ethno-sectarian conflict, this is the widely used concept with regard to the Middle Eastern politics or the interaction between state and society. And we're going to highlight different conceptualization or theoretical frameworks that tackle the ethno-sectarian identity and whether or not it's something exogenous, fixed and exogenous to human being, or it's something endogenous and fluid and inherently constructed. And I'm going to touch upon third stream in the literature, what's called instrumentalism, but sometimes you can find it integrated or incorporated into constructivism as well. And then we're going to interrogate the causal effect of ethnicity and how literature uses actually ethnicity or ethnic identity to make and test causal claims with regard to the violence and civil wars and regime destabilization. And then we are going to bring it back to the Middle Eastern context, and we talk about like sectarian ethnic identity in relation to nationalism, and we're going to highlight two main frameworks: sociological contribution to identity politics, and to what extent the construction of sectarian identity contributed to the emergence or the transformation of all-encompassing national image or national identity, and ethno-symbolism as well. And this is, we're going to pick it up from there in order to discuss the Israeli and the Iraqi cases in the seminar. So let's start out with some like definitions or like distinction, like some sort of distinction between ethnic identity and other forms of identities. What's ethnicity and what constitutes ethnic identity? Anyone? So what's ethnicity? What's ethnic identity all about?
Shared history, but also...
Yeah. So basically, it's something, and what would gather, what would bring together, these features or these attributes as identity markers or ethnic identity markers. Like take it to the abstract level, like, this kind of common history, common culture, physical features. What would bring them together? How can we classify them? Is there any single rubric that can like classify or capture like these kind of features or attributes? Okay, so this is actually a highly contested concept, like in the literature. What identities we classify as ethnic identities? Are there any kind of properties that are unique or disproportionately associated with this kind of ethnicity or ethnic identity? Is it related to common ancestry, common history, common culture, common territory, or network ties, like tribal affiliation or kinship ties? What actually constituted this? Like Chandra offered, this definition about ethnic identity and what kind of identities we classify as ethnic, and she talks about, like, she defined this as an arbitrary subset of categories in which descent-based attributes are necessary to determine eligibility for membership. So some sort of identity markers or attributes would define the membership in particular communities or groups based on genetic inheritance, something related to the skin color, black or white, gender, physical features, like, for example, Asians are different from Middle Eastern or Europeans, or something related to cultural and historical inheritance, like names, languages, place of birth, or some sort of acquired attributes that one would acquire in the course of life and would be defined as markers of inheritance, such as the last names and tribal markers or tribal affiliations. So what would bring them together? Take this to the abstract level, like this kind of stickiness, at least in the, like what she mentioned, like at least in the short run, these are you cannot change, these kind of attributes or identity markers. So they are not fixed, but they are like, some of the main features are stickiness. Like people can change their gender and color, but not on the, like this is on the long run, not in the short run. And visibility, like, the membership in particular groups or community has to be visible according to some visible attributes or visible markers in order to observe, these kind of features and make causal claims about the effect of ethnic identities on violence, on distribution of public goods, on whatever outcome variable you need to talk about or you need to examine. So in the Middle East, like the widely used concept is like sect or sectarianism. Any thought on how we distinguish it? Like, is there any distinction between ethnicity and sectarianism, like sectarian identity and ethnic identity? Yeah, it's widely used, in the Middle Eastern context in order to make, this kind of causal claims or all-encompassing claims about religious animosity or religious conflict, which is like, and mainly between Sunni and Shia. Fanar Haddad mentioned, like, this sectarian or the sect, perhaps it's a narrower category from like this kind of ethnicity, and it's a salient form of collective identification. So it's widely used in the Middle East, or like to make causal claims about the Middle Eastern politics and social dynamics in order to highlight this kind of monolithic and fixed identity in religious identity in relation to animosity, antagonism between different religious groups. So like sometimes it's a vague concept with regard to like it doesn't help us understand these kind of political dynamics, because they use it in order to make and test causal claims rather than offering a clear definition or demarcating the boundaries between this concept and other concepts in the Middle East. So there is a problem with the conceptual boundaries, because linguistically speaking, it has like this negative connotation. It's mainly related to this kind of sectarian stripes and mainly like, this kind of animosity between religious groups or different sectarian groups, or the intercommunal conflict based on this heightening of the sectarian identity, or they use it in order to make some sort of policy recommendations. How can we sectarianize the public space, the public sphere? How can we reduce conflict between different sectarian groups, rather than using this in order to understand political and social dynamics in some societies. So they the problem here is like they use it as a catch-all category by blurring the boundaries between different sectarian identities. So even like within Shia community, there could be other sort of identity, like different sort of differentiation or identity differentiation within the same community, rather than painting them all with the broad brush. And they use it, as I mentioned, in order to understand this kind of animosity, antagonism between different communities, rather than based on, like, irrespective of this kind of ascriptive markers. So based on like this Sunni and Shia division, so they make, some sort of claims about geopolitical conflict or geostrategic competition, for example, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So they use it in order to understand, this kind of intercommunal struggles or strifes, or to understand this kind of non-state actors, the role of Hezbollah in Syria, in the civil war in Syria, the role of Iran and the conflict, the role of the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia in shaping, the geostrategic competition in the region, and instead of asking, different questions, to what extent, these kind of sectarian identities perhaps would construct or inscribe different visions about, nation state, irrespective of this kind of conflict, to what extent this helped, some groups in order to constitute or to have like this imagery, national imagery about nation state, or about like state building and state transformation, as it happened in Iraq, for example, after the American or the American invasion in 2002. So it depends on what kind of questions, they ask, and sometimes, it's one problem with this kind of blurring boundaries of sectarian identities. They use it as a form of collective identification, but it might be used as or it could be applicable to individual identification as well, as a property of individual attributes rather than for attributes of collective solidarity. For example, as a Shia community, so within, the Shia community, you can find, some individuals that they have different form of self-identification. What kind of problems, they have, what kind of how they identify themselves, to this cultural and social groups. So perhaps they could, some individuals would be related more to Iraq rather than Iran. So they form, this kind of, they affiliate more to or with the nation state rather than the supranational identity of the Shia category. So what level of analysis we are talking about? Is it form of collectiveness or group solidarities, or individual form of identification or personal identification, how they understand their own problems, how they identify with these social and cultural groups, what would orient and guide, their actions. So what level of analysis we are talking about? We are going to apply this shortly, but before we talk about the Middle East or the Middle Eastern context, where we need to understand, the theoretical roots, or what constitutes, or where, this kind of ethno-sectarian identity comes from. So any take on this, whether or not it's constructed, this kind of identity is constructed, or fixed and exogenous to human being?
We created it so that then we could use it for policy making, or to understand conflict in regions, or various different purposes. But human being isn't something that's inherent to them. It's something we come up with to help us analyze.
Yeah, there is a theoretical divide. One would argue, primordialism, they would argue that it's fixed and exogenous to human being. So these kind of individual properties, people were born, that they are not acquired, like these kind of features or identity markers. So they are static, and they use it like the literature uses, these kind of primordial tendencies in order to make causal claims. So rather than offering definition again or conceptual framework or conceptualization of these kind of ethno-sectarian identities, so they use it, they take it for granted, and they make, in order to make causal claims in social science. Here, from these traditions, some sort of like the most prominent ones, like these kind of ethnicities are relational. Here, like Geertz mentioned, that this kind of primordial attachment, something personal and something one is born into, a particular religious community, speaking a particular language and following particular social practices. And like Ernst Gellner takes it to a different level in order to highlight how, like, this ethnicity or overlapping between ethnic identity and national identity would help, like, with the state building processes and nation building as well. So if there is, like, kind of overlap between ethnic ideology or ethnicity and nationalism, so the nation state would emerge and would be dominated by this one ethnic group, and this the ethnic group will have like monopoly over the official symbols and legislation in order to continue or to perpetuate this kind of imagery, or to instill or to sustain this collective or national imagery about the self-belonging or identification with these kind of groups that are like totally overlapped or congruent with the geographical boundary or the geographical territory of the nation state. So primarily it's a political principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent. In brief, nationalism is the theory of political legitimacy, which requires that ethnic boundaries shouldn't cut across political ones. And like we can discuss this further in the seminar when we discuss the case of Israel. To what extent, they use, this kind of ethnic identities in order to establish or to legitimize the emergence of Israel, and what are the repercussions, of this kind of overlap between, or the congruence between national identity and ethnic identity. So the other trend, like it's like the totally like on the opposite. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The language, yeah.
Because the language in itself is not what is constitutive of Azerbaijan and I speak the institution. Is it not something I was born with, but it's something like, it's like a social construct, it's the society I'm exposed to.
Yeah, this is what like primordialism, like.
Then there's a value, a concept. Do you think so? With this?
My opinion?
No, like what I'm saying is.
This is what they say.
Yes,
Yeah, you.
Primordialism.
Yeah.
And they mention the language as their argument.
Mm-hmm.
But then,
That's why, like the other trend would mention, it's constructed. Like it depends on like the historical and the political environment and the institutions that would construct this kind of self-identification. So how would a person that like would consider like the like speak Arabic, for example, and then they are like they are Arabs, but they don't like speak Arabic. So to what extent they will self-identify themselves to this particular group? So it depends on like the historical context or the institutional context that would heighten or make some sort of self-identification salient. So this is constructivism. So that's what I'm saying. Like for them, it's not fixed; it's fluid and endogenous to human being. like, people would construct, this kind of, depending on this kind of intersubjective interaction between different individuals or groups, they would like negotiate, these kind of identities and would construct, different form of self-identification or sense of belonging. So for them, it's not ahistorical, and it's immutable and contextualized. So you need to understand the context and the politics and the history that would actually offer some degree of salience of some identities in different time periods. So for them, like Chandra, for example, she talks about like nominal forms of identification or nominal attributes, and these kind of normal attributes would be activated at certain point in time, and we need to understand how these kind of normal like nominal attributes would be activated. So people could, like, throughout their lives, they didn't identify themselves as based on language, for example, and all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, so some sort of like the context and some sort of political dynamics help them develop this form of self-identification. So you need to understand how these forms of identities got activated, and what kind of politics, history, and institutions involved that helped activate these forms of attribution or identity markers. So you need to ask different questions, how these identities, or how these forms of attributes got constructed and experienced and perceived and utilized. So it's an independent variable rather than an outcome variable. So you need to understand how they got activated and constructed through these kind of lived experiences. For them, this kind of, you need like political leadership, like identity entrepreneurs, in order to activate, these kind of identities, and use this for political reasons, perhaps to reconstruct different collective national image, as it happened with Shia in Iraq. Like the Israeli, like Ben Gurion, for example, how he used the Jewishness in order to instill beliefs and create this kind of national identity in Israel after the emergence of Israel. So it's not like it's not a heuristic shift. It's lived experience. You need these kind of self-identification or identity markers or attributes have to be lived or experienced and utilized in order to be constructed. And you need to ask these kind of questions in order to understand why they got activated or they became immensely salient at some point in time, rather than other. So it's not like, again, it's not ahistorical, and you cannot depoliticize as well. So you need to bring in, institutions, context, history back into the analysis in order to understand the fluidity and the mutability of these kind of identity markers. Like a third stream, this is like some literature would separate, this stream in the literature, because it's based on, or it draws on Weberian tradition when it comes to the emergence of like a rational bureaucratic apparatus. So they took it in order to understand the organizational behavior, and the social institutionalism emanates from these traditions in order to understand how rules or organizational behaviors would be used in order to exclude, some groups and include others based on this status group. So they use laws and rules in order to demarcate the boundaries between what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, in order to exclude, to define, the in groups and the out groups. But you can use it within the framework of constructivism, because if you need to highlight the role of the political leadership in mitigating or in downplaying, these kind of ethno-sectarian identity, or heightening or accentuating, these kind of identities, so they instrumentalize, these kind of political discourse, legislations and laws, as we're going to discuss what happened in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, for example, after the eruption of the Iraq-Iran war, when they issued, laws about the unity of the family behind the borders in order to legitimize the deportation of the Shia from Iraq. So it's still part and parcel of this kind of constructivism, So in the MENA, like in the Middle East, what kind of sectarian divisions we have? If I ask you about, like, if I ask you how we map out, these kind of sectarian divisions in the region, can anyone offer an answer? We talked about religion, like mainly like Muslim and Christians, and within Muslims you have like Sunni and Shia. What other divisions we have? No, but ethno-sectarian, yeah. Ju- in Yeah, so it's racial, perhaps, like yeah, you're. So here we have like this Arabness, like you have like the based on the language, but the within this category you find divisions across religious or along religious lines. The Jewishness, it's an ethnic difference between like Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs and Jewish community in Israel, and the Kurdish question as well. So the vast majority of them are Muslim, but like within the Kurdish question, you find some sort of divisions along language, like they don't speak Arabic. So you have like divisions along racial, linguistic, and religious lines, and possibly along class lines as well, as we are going to discuss in the seminar. In the case of Israel, so we are going to we're not going to touch upon the Palestinians. We're going to discuss what's going on inside the Israeli societies, how this kind of all-encompassing or all-inclusive Jewishness created some sort of divisions between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi, for example, like Jewish from Western countries and Jewish like they had like Eastern origins. So they had like other sort of elements like class and racial elements as well. So, like, in order to understand, this rigidity of the structure of this, like, ethno-sectarian identities versus, the saliency and the fluidity of this, I need to provide you with some examples in order to understand why we should ask different questions in order to understand these kind of political and social dynamics. For example, like when it comes to the relevance, how it gained, some sort of relevance in a particular historical moment. So you need to bring back, you need to bring politics and institutions back into the analysis. For example, the civil war in Lebanon during in the 19th century under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. So what happened, it was like, some sort of conflict between Druze and Maronite. But the external intervention with the intervention of the French authority or France that helped, to ratify, this kind of agreement or treaties that led to the emergence or the constitution or the establishment of this administrative unit called Mutasarrifiyya. So it's an administrative unit based on communal lines. So based on this kind of lived experience of the Lebanese people, so they started, it became part and parcel of their daily practices or daily lives. So they did experience, these kind of communal differentiation, and this heightened, this kind of attributes or self-identification with Maronite or with basically with Maronites. So this kind of organization and establishment along communal sectarian lines, it became like the people experienced these kind of communal divisions and became, part of this self-identification, continual reproduction of self against other. So this kind of institute, but not necessarily, it didn't necessarily lead to like the emergence of conflict, but it became like part and parcel of their self-identification with specific or particular social and social groups or political and social communities. So institutions and formulas of political representation as well would deepen, this kind of self-affirmation and intercommunal divisions. And how it's perceived and utilized, for example, like you need to understand as well, like, this kind of geopolitical and geostrategic elements or competition with the emergence or the existence of non-state actors that would actually add, to these kind of sectarian elements or sectarian divisions. Like we're going to discuss this further in the last week, like, when we talk about like geopolitics and the reproduction of the state power and how the existence of these non-state actors based on these kind of communal divisions or sectarian divisions would shape and reshape the regional landscape or the regional competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and Hezbollah on the one hand, and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. So you need to understand how these kind of geopolitical competition would help or trigger, these kind of intercommunal division or self-affirmation. So basically, like it could be created or constructed from above, like, it's a top-down approach of sectarianizing, the political and social landscape. And even with the establishment of this kind of all-encompassing or inclusive national imagery, so you can find some sort of social stratification, as we are going to discuss again in the seminar, like within, this Jewishness category, you can find, different forms of like social stratification within the in-group members or within the in-group community. Yeah.
I just missed what was that.
متصرفية, yeah, they created, this kind of administrative unit in order to run, some sort of public affairs, and they created it based on these kind of communal lines. So they allocated, some sort of posts, for Maronites or people, the Christian people, and others, for Druze people. So this, it's a treaty. It's an Arabic word. Yeah. It's an agreement between the Ottoman Empire and the French authority in order to mitigate, the sectarian stripes in Lebanon after the eruption of the civil war in 1860. Yeah, because there existed, some sort of civil wars and rebellion under the Ottoman rule. Okay. So the literature uses, these kind of ethno-sectarian identity in order to test or to make causal claims. According to Chandra, so you can be critical of this, but this is what she mentioned. Like they make like claims about something else, not the ethnicity per se. So it's as we're going to say, like they frame it as ethnicity, but it's something else, as we are going to see shortly. So they focus on ethnic identity in relation to violence, how ethnicity or ethnic identity would trigger violence. So you have like different streams under this like heading, like security dilemma, for example. So the analogy here in like the IR people, like as the international system is anarchical, and the international system lacks, some sort of central government. So states have or are obliged to arm themselves in order to feel like secure or to defend themselves against any external threat. Like the analogy here, like by applying this to comparative politics, so the state during the time of or multi-ethnic state during like collapsing time or social upheaval. So different ethnic groups, they felt, this kind of threatening context, and they have like, to launch their offensive in order to provide security for their groups. So because of this kind of increased threats, so they might like each group will have like, will find it like rational or attractive option to strike first in order to provide security for themselves and for their own group. For her, like, it's the underlying logic here or the underlying assumption, they assume this kind of fixedness, like they didn't assume like, they didn't actually consider any kind of switch, to the less threatening identity. So they assume the fixedness of these kind of ethnic identity, or that would like feed into violence. Or perhaps like it could be framed as intergroup or intergroups struggle or rivalry, rather than different ethnicities fighting each other. So here, like, for fixedness, like, it's not like switch of identities, but in the civil war in Lebanon, for example, like Christians, they found, Shia like identity is less threatening, so that's why they allied themselves, to Shia against Sunni, rather than arming themselves in order to some of them, rather than arming themselves, or siding with Christian groups in the war. For another extreme, they focus on emotional triggers, like if people in threatening contexts, so ethnic groups might find it like rational or not rational, or might resort to these kind of violence or attacking, other groups in order for fear of being attacked by these groups, especially given, the perhaps like history of animosity or antagonism between between these groups, or resentment. So perhaps like some social groups would find an opportunity during the collapsing time to capitalize on this resentful feelings in order to rectify the imbalances in the social or the group hierarchies. So that's why in order to rectify the social hierarchy, so they resorted to violence in order to improve, their position in the group hierarchies. Or hatred, like past history of animosity and rivalry between different groups would trigger, this kind of violence between different groups when the context is ripe for attacking, the other groups. So the underlying assumptions here, again, it's kind of beliefs and emotions rather than fixed identity marker or some sort of attributes that triggered, these groups or pushed these groups to launch, offensive or to engage in violent act against other groups. Can you apply this to the Middle East? How security dilemma and emotional triggers. Perhaps like the civil war in Syria, like this kind of like they felt like you cannot like you cannot totally agree, with Chandra, like that this kind of ethnicity should be relegated, to like the marginal spot, but like it could happen, but because of this kind of common history, it's in conjunction with this kind of identity markers or sectarian history of sectarianist tribes. So between like Alawites and Sunni, this actually triggered or prolonged the civil war and triggered different sponsors or different external players to get engaged in the war based on these kind of ethno-sectarian differentiation. Emotional triggers, it could be applied as well, like, this kind of resentful feelings and fears and hatred as well. You can find these kind of beliefs and emotions as triggers, for instigating violent or armed resistance against Alawites and Houthi groups in Yemen, for example, in order to rectify, this kind of imbalances social structure or the social hierarchy. So that's why they engaged, in these kind of violence against. So they perhaps like it's still like kind of ethnic and ethno-sectarian identity in conjunction with other factors as beliefs and common history of animosity between different groups. Another like broader stream in the literature focuses on ethnicity as an independent variable that would lead to regime destabilization. So one trend focuses on like if the group or some sort of sectarian or ethnic groups, they have already some sort of well-established attributes, or they self-identify themselves with certain markers, or they have like certain markers in addition to economic specialization or clear division of labor. So they might, when situations or political context is permissible, so they might use this in order to establish their own state. So this kind of incipient nations, as it happened with Rojava and the Kurds, for example, in Syria. So they had this kind of, they built on their local networks, they built on their associations in order to build their own state on the northwest. So for Chandra, it's an assumption about common history and plus functional differentiation. So perhaps this kind of ethno-sectarian identification in addition to functional differentiation as well, that help them to materialize a political project. Another stream they focus, but this is inconclusive, about destabilization of democracy. For example, they mentioned if in multi-ethnic society or highly heterogeneous society, if democracy and popular vote produces permanent losers and permanent winners, and this actually would politicize ethnic identity and would trigger some sort of destabilization of the entire regime. So the underlying assumption here is this fixedness of ethnic identity. If it's true, if it's fixed, so all the other assumptions or propositions will fall through. And another stream focuses on the unstable multi-ethnic transitioning regime. During transitional period in multi-ethnic society, this will this kind of ethnic composition would destabilize the newly emerging or the transitioning regime. Why? Because the popular vote would empower the previously excluded groups and would actually dip in the coffer of the predominant market forces or predominant classes that they have this disproportionate monopoly or control over the national wealth. For her, for Chandra, it's an assumption about, fixedness of the identity, ethnic identity, and the distribution of wealth. So perhaps it might be depicted as a class struggle rather than ethnic conflict or multi-ethnic conflict. So the effect on the stabilization or destabilization of democracies or transitioning regimes, it's highly contested and inconclusive in the literature. I'm going to highlight, the major trends here. Some would argue that there is an inverted U-shaped relationship. So perhaps in democracies, they have well-established institutions and full guarantees of civil and political rights, so the people wouldn't resort to this kind of violent action or insurgency to destabilize the regime. And there are no rebels in authoritarianism. So perhaps in only transitioning regimes or semi or unconsolidated democracies, this would help different ethnic groups to emerge and to destabilize the entire regime. Others would function that it's in conjunction with, or it's an interaction effect, democracy plus other factors, the civil war, bad neighborhoods, diffusion and spillover effects, not like democracy per se, or the ethnicity and the destabilization of political regimes per se. Leadership, rationality, and utility maximization. So perhaps constellation of power structure and leadership choice. So perhaps if they know beforehand the size of the ethnic group, so they might opt for the minimum winning coalition rather than resorting to a violent act or instigating ethnic violence. Chandra again mentioned that it's only in societies that they lack multidimensional competition or cross-cutting cleavages that would offer different groups or the individuals with different memberships in different groups. So this would actually ethnicity or politicization of ethnicity would trigger, these kind of violence and would destabilize newly emerging democracies or transitioning regimes. So I'm not sure, to what extent this would be applicable, but if you like this kind of multi-ethnic transitioning regime, even like people like in Egypt and they have like different sort of divisions that actually precluded the transitioning regime or hindered democratic regime to strike roots in society. But it's not, again, like regarding even like highly homogeneous societies. They have like these kind of divisions according to class conflict, distribution of wealth, this kind of territorial concentrations or lack of networks. This actually would stabilize. It's not like ethno-sectarian identity per se. So back again to like the ethnicity and in relation to violence or nationalism, like here in the Middle East, we can understand this kind of ethno-sectarian identity in or not only to understand violent actions or violent dynamics or antagonism, but you need to highlight the synergies between like these kind of ethno-sectarian identities and the creation of a nation state. So like here, like Fanar Haddad mentioned that there is kind of symbiotic relationships rather than the synergies between both of them in order to understand the state formation and transformation. And this is very clear in the case of Iraq, as we are going to see how like certain communities or groups would reproduce, their power, or would have like this kind of national imagery live, like in their like imagination, or the inscribe different visions of all-inclusive national identity. Here, like how the construction of identity through these kind of social relations would help us understand how the creation or the establishment or the construction of collective mode of condition of cognition would be helpful in order to understand different political and social dynamics. For example, like political leadership, they used this kind of national truth and in order to make claims, in order to create this all-inclusive national identity or exclude other groups, as it happened in Iraq, as we are going to highlight. In Iran, for example, they used these kind of collectiveness. They used like Shiism and religion in order to highlight different ways of seeing the world, in order to construct this kind of line between the usage of religion in order to establish sovereign and autonomous political regime vis-a-vis or in confrontation with the Shah that aligned, himself, or the regime that aligned itself with the imperial power. And so they created, different ways of seeing, the world, or making sense of the world, and they making, some sort of inclusive or national truth or claims in order to gather people or to help people self-identify with these groups. As Shiism, for example, they used, this kind of victimhood or the shared history of persecution in order to make use of the state transformation or the transformation period after the American invasion, and to create different national imagery or collective mood of cognition amongst Shia groups. So they use it in order to reconstruct, their own, to produce different meanings and reconstruct their own realities about the self and the otherness. So you need to ask away, like, different questions: what constituted, the boundaries between in-group and out-groups, and how it's constituted, how it's reproduced, and what are the implications or the repercussions of this constitution of boundaries. This is the seminar issues. Like, for example, like, in order to understand how they are fluid and context dependent, so you need like to understand. We are going to highlight, the Iraqi case, especially after the first and the second Gulf War. But before that, how Saddam Hussein actually it was like a totally totalitarian regime, but how he used, this kind of national or all-encompassing category in order to overcome this division between Sunni and Shia and entrench his political power. How he used, this in the official discourse. I'm not sure if you like, for non-Arabs, there is like, the division between Sunni and Shia based on historical rivalry between Imam Ali and Muawiyah, like Muawiyah the Sunni and the Shia who supported, Imam Ali. How he used, this in order to, in his political speeches and discourse, he Muawiyah and depicted, Imam Ali as the real representative or the real representation of the Islamic values. And while like in the Muawiyah, the founder of the Arab Sunni Umayyad dynasty, he was a man fighting for the sake of earthly temptations. So this is how he used, these kind of like discourse in order to entrench, his role and to highlight, to put them all together in this exclusive or all-inclusive national identity based on injustice. They both fight against injustice rather than creating, divisions between both of them. And it helped him, like, in order to create, and that's why, like, he put like injustice that enabled, his clan, to dominate the political scene without triggering any kind of sectarian division. Because for them, it's to create elites rather than Sunni elites against or versus Shia. This is how identity or the construction and reconstruction of identity could be used in order to, the certain public imagery regarding, the collectiveness or the relation to the nation state. How they use, this kind of ethno-symbolism in order to have like in different form of meanings of the or to have like to fill this national identity with some political content. For example, like the Jewish people, they used this kind of the Holocaust and the victimhood and the history of the persecution. It was like part and parcel of the main pillars of the ideology of Zionism, and they picked and choose from this kind of common history and common culture and common religion in order to activate this kind of form of national collective national imagery, and to take ownership of the state and exclude others as well. They established the boundary between the self and the other, and this actually created social stratification within the in-group community or the in-group members. Here, Ben-Gurion, the founder of the Israeli state, he mentioned that we don't want Israelis to become Arabs. We are in duty bound to fight against the spirit of the Levant, which corrupts individuals and societies and preserve the authentic Jewish values as they crystallized in the diaspora. So this is how they created, they added, other elements regarding to the civicness or the Western culture to the Jewishness category in order to segregate or to separate, Mizrahi or Eastern Jewish from this all-encompassing Jewishness category, because it had like, this kind of racial element and class element as well. Because like Mizrahi, that they came from Middle Eastern or Eastern origins, most of them, they came from lower classes, and they have like, Arab origins as well. So they blended together, religion, class, and race in order to create, this notion of Jewishness, and we are going to discuss this further in the seminar. Another like ethno-symbolism, the Kurds as well. We are going to discuss them further next week when we talk about displacement and immigration. So here, like the Kurdistan region that actually cuts across like different boundaries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So how like they had like this collective memories of statelessness and history of persecution and exploitation, in addition to the language. So here language is very important in order to highlight their distinctiveness in relation to others, because it's a relational concept. So they built on their networks and associations, and they kept, this imagery alive, like how they have, like, they might not know each other, they might not meet each other, but they have like this kind of imagined community. So they have, like, they should have their own nation state. So that's why after they brought history, they draw on their historical memories of the revolts against the Turkification or the Ataturk notion of a form of nationalism that actually excluded, Kurds from it, and the Kurdish revolts in Iraq, and their historical segregation or displacement in Syria, because they were robbed of any kind of citizenship rights. So this kind of, they used, these kind of networks, associations, intellectual history and intellectual production and common history in order to activate, this kind of collective mobilization and to establish their own autonomous administrative or administration of North and East Syria, which is called Rojava in 2016, before like the agreement between Bashar and Turkey actually undermined their autonomous position. Any question? We will talk more about, this kind of identity, the construction and reconstruction of identities in relation to state formation and state transformation, and with this application to Iraq and Israel, as two contrasting perhaps cases, how, like, they created, a vision of nation state in Israel with some sort of a stratification within, the same category, and how, like, this kind of antagonistic or distinctive line between self and other had been, like, shaped and reshaped throughout history in Iraq, given, like, this kind of context specific.